get on your knees. Right? Here. Right now, the voice belonged to Officer Derek Holloway, and it carried across the lobby of the Colton Ridge Police Department loud enough that 3 clerks at the front counter stopped typing. A man in a plain gray field jacket sank down onto the cold tile, his hands cuffed behind him, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall just above the doorway. Somebody near the copy machine laughed. Nobody in that room believed the military identification card sitting in the evidence tray was real. Nobody knew that the man on his knees was General Marcus Kane, a 4-star officer of the United States Army, and that inside a locked case, 11 feet away, sat the evidence that would end 3 careers, a $200 million contract, and a chief of police's freedom before the sun went down. 22 minutes later, the ground outside the station began to shake. 8 armored vehicles rolled into the parking lot in a formation so precise it looked rehearsed. 38 soldiers stepped down in 2 clean lines, and every conversation inside that building died at once. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when an entire police station realizes, all together, in the same silent second, that it has made an unrecoverable mistake, stay with this one to the end. It gets worse before it gets better, and the ending is not the one you are expecting. The morning had started 9 hours earlier and 300 miles away, inside a windowless testing facility outside Fort Calloway, Georgia. General Marcus Kane, 58 years old, had spent 11 days reviewing data nobody wanted him to find. A defense contractor called Callahan Armor Industries had won a $340 million contract to supply ballistic plating for combat units deploying that spring. The plating had failed in 6 of 11 live tests. Not failed by a margin. Failed catastrophically, the kind of failure that gets a soldier's name read out at a memorial service instead of at a promotion ceremony. Marcus had the lab results, the falsified certification numbers, and a whistleblower's signed statement locked inside a reinforced case. And he was due at Fort Calloway by 2 o'clock that afternoon to hand all of it to a federal prosecutor named Diane Whitfield. He drove alone. That detail matters, so hold on to it. His usual 4-man security detail had been rerouted 11 minutes behind him on a separate channel, a standard precaution meant to keep the case's exact location uncertain until the last possible mile. Marcus drove an unmarked government sport utility vehicle with government plates and nothing else. No flag decal, no insignia, no rank stitched anywhere visible. He wore the same gray jacket he always wore on transport days. Because 34 years in uniform had taught him that the men who need to announce their rank are usually the ones who have never had to earn quiet respect for it. Marcus grew up the son of a warehouse loader in Albany, Georgia, in a house where nobody had ever worn a uniform that wasn't a work uniform. His father, Elijah Kane, had wanted to enlist in 1968 and been turned away for a heart murmur. An Army doctor never bothered to confirm with a second opinion. Elijah carried that rejection the rest of his life the way some men carry a limp. Quietly and only noticeable if you knew to look. When Marcus shipped out for basic training at 19, his father pressed a scratched brass coin into his palm, an old railroad token with no value anywhere except in that family, and told him, "Wear the uniform. Don't ever let it wear you." Marcus had carried that coin in his left breast pocket through 2 deployments, 4 promotions, and 34 years, and it was in his pocket that morning too, pressed flat against his heart, while a temporary detour sign redirected him off Highway 19 and onto a quiet 2-lane road running through the outskirts of a town called Colton Ridge. He had made general at 49, one of the youngest officers in his branch to do it that decade. And he had done it without ever once raising his voice in a briefing room to be heard. His mentor, a retired lieutenant colonel named Otis Bramwell, had told him once that some men command a room by getting louder, and some command it by making everyone else lean in to listen. and that the second kind lasts longer because nobody ever gets tired of being trusted to pay attention. Marcus had built his entire career on that lesson. Soldiers who served under him talked less about his medals than about the fact that he remembered the names of their children. That was the man driving down Highway 19 that morning. Not a symbol, not a headline waiting to happen, just a 58-year-old officer thinking about a report he needed to deliver by 2 o'clock. His father's coin resting against his heart, with no idea at all what the next 4 hours were about to cost him. He had no way of knowing that sign had been placed there 11 hours earlier by a contractor with ties to Callahan Armor Industries. He had no way of knowing that a man named Derek Holloway, 34 years old, badge number 214, had already clocked him from the opposite lane and was turning his cruiser around before Marcus had even finished reading the detour sign twice. Derek Holloway did not run the plate through dispatch before hitting his lights. That single decision, skipping 11 seconds of procedure, is the hinge this entire story turns on, so notice it now, because it will come back. He pulled Marcus over on a stretch of road with no other cars in sight, no cameras except the one mounted on his own dashboard, and no witnesses except a hawk circling somewhere above the tree line. When Marcus lowered his window, Derek's eyes moved over him. The way you'd inspect something you already suspected was stolen. The plain jacket, the calm hands resting on the wheel, the total absence of anything that told him who he was dealing with. Derek asked who the vehicle belonged to. Marcus answered evenly that it was a federal vehicle assigned to his official duties. Derek laughed, short and dismissive, the kind of laugh a man makes when he has already decided the conversation is over. Marcus handed over his driver's license and his military identification without a word of protest. Derek barely glanced at either before tossing the ID card back through the window and telling him it looked like something printed off a website. Marcus asked, without raising his voice by a single degree, that Derek call Fort Calloway and confirm his identity before this went any further. Derek ignored him completely, hands on the hood. Don't ask me another question. Notice what Marcus did not do. He did not argue. He did not reach for his phone. He did not raise his voice even a half step above where it had started. 34 years of combat leadership had taught him that the man who stays calmest in a dangerous room is usually the one who survives it. And some instinct, older than rank, told him this road, this officer, this morning had already stopped being about a traffic stop. He stepped out, placed his palms flat on the hood, and watched Derek's hands and posture with the trained attention of a man who has spent 3 decades reading danger before it arrives. Derek Holloway had grown up 2 towns over, the son of a man who'd worn the same badge for 26 years, and told his son at every dinner table that respect was something you took, not something you waited around to be given. Derek believed in the specific, unshakable way a man believes something he has never once been forced to examine, that he was good at his job because he trusted his gut, and his gut had never once, in 8 years on patrol, told him it was wrong. It had told him plenty of things about plenty of people, and every complaint that ever tried to say otherwise had a way of disappearing from the file before it reached anyone who mattered. He didn't think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as thorough. That distinction, the story he told himself about who he was, is exactly the kind of thing that makes a man dangerous in a uniform, because he never has to stop and ask whether the badge is doing the thinking for him. That's the first anchor. Remember the coin in his pocket. It will matter again in about 20 minutes, and it will matter one final time at the very end of this story, in a way that will make you go back and re-watch the beginning. When Derek's eyes drifted to the black case strapped into the back seat, something in his face sharpened, and he asked, a little too fast, a little too interested, "What's in the case?" Marcus told him plainly that it was federal property, and that Derek had no authority to open it without someone qualified present. That answer, calm, factual, offered without an ounce of hostility, seemed to land on Derek like a personal insult. He spun Marcus around, kicked his legs apart, and began a rough pat-down, despite there being no visible evidence of any crime whatsoever, while Marcus repeated, steady as a metronome, that Derek should activate his body camera and call the base. Derek reached up and switched the camera off. He did not know that 11 seconds of footage had already synced automatically to the department's cloud server, preserving everything that happened before the screen went dark. He pulled the ID card free again and read the name off it out loud in a mocking sing-song, laughing at the idea that a real general would be caught driving alone down a back road in Colton Ridge, Georgia. Marcus told him that rank had never determined how a man dressed or how he chose to travel. The words did nothing to soften Derek's face. Derek told him to come up with a better story. A passing pickup truck slowed to watch, and Derek immediately threatened to arrest the driver if a phone came out. The driver pulled away frightened, but not before a 9-second clip had already been recorded and sent, without a single word of explanation, to a cousin 2 counties over. Derek radioed the station. He reported that he detained a man impersonating a military officer, driving a vehicle that might be stolen, carrying a locked case he refused to explain. The dispatcher who picked up was Maya Sutton, 29 years old, 7 months into the job. The kind of quiet, careful employee who double-checks everything twice because she has watched what happens to people who don't. Maya ran the plate. A rare red banner appeared across her screen, a federal property flag requiring direct verbal contact with Fort Calloway before any further action. Before she could relay a single word of that to Derek, Chief Russell Vance appeared behind her without a sound, the way he always did, and asked to take the call himself. His tone was casual. His eyes were not. They were locked on her monitor, like a man reading a scoreboard. Vance listened as Derek described the driver, the case, the refusal to explain its contents. Something moved across the chief's face for exactly 1 second. Not surprise, Maya would say later, under oath, in a courtroom that would go dead silent when she said it. Recognition. Instead of ordering Marcus released on the spot, Vance told Derek to bring both the man and the case straight to the station. No explanation. No questions about identity at all. Maya sat there with a federal verification flag glowing red on her screen and watched her chief walk away from it without a flicker of curiosity, and something cold settled into her stomach that she would not be able to name for another 6 hours. Before he was folded into the back of the cruiser, Marcus looked directly at Derek and told him there was still time to make that call, before this went further than Derek could pull it back from. Derek laughed the warning off as the bluff of a desperate man with nothing left to threaten him with. He had no idea, in that moment, that the balance of power in his hands was already a rented thing, and the bill was coming due. Back at the station, Chief Vance stepped into his office, shut the door, and dialed a private number. "Now they've got the case," he said, his voice low and practiced in a way that told you this was not the first call like it he had ever made. Marcus was walked in through a rear entrance, away from the cameras that covered the street-facing doors. Derek refused to let him sit in the holding area reserved for detainees, and instead forced him to stand facing a cinder-block wall for 11 straight minutes, ignoring every request for basic procedure. A handful of officers wandered by to watch, drawn by Derek loudly announcing that he'd caught somebody pretending to be a 4-star general. A claim that got 3 laughs and 1 uncomfortable silence from an officer named Priya Chen, 26 years old, 11 months on the job, who looked at the floor and said nothing at all, because she had 2 more years left on her probationary contract and a younger brother's college tuition riding on this paycheck. Remember, Priya, not every witness in this story gets to be brave, and that's part of the point. Marcus said nothing in his own defense. He quietly noted the position of every camera in the room, the names on the visible badges, the layout of the exits, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 3 decades of service, now working in a very different kind of environment. By then his shoulders had begun to ache from standing at that unnatural angle against the wall, and the zip tie binding his wrists had cut a thin red line into the skin he wouldn't notice fully until hours later. He did not shift his weight. He did not sigh. Somewhere behind him, a printer kept spitting out paper on an ordinary rhythm, as if the building itself hadn't yet realized what was happening inside it, and that ordinary sound, mundane, indifferent, pressed harder against him than any single word Derek had said all morning. It is one thing to be shouted at. It is another thing entirely to be humiliated while the world around you keeps humming along exactly the way it always has, as though you were never anything more than a minor interruption to somebody else's Tuesday. Maya found Vance in the hallway and asked, quietly, whether they should just call Fort Calloway to clear up the confusion. Vance told her the military had no authority to interfere in a local investigation, a claim so wrong it should have set off alarms for anyone with a badge. Since verifying a military ID typically takes about 4 minutes on a secure line. Vance walked into the interview room next, adopting a tone of polite curiosity, and asked Marcus what exactly was inside the case. Marcus told him he'd answer questions once someone from military legal counsel or a federal prosecutor was present. Vance offered what he framed as a reasonable deal. Give up the access code, and the department might consider letting this whole misunderstanding go. That offer told Marcus everything. The vehicle, the ID, none of it had ever been the real target. It was the case. He asked Vance, evenly, how he happened to already know the case required an access code at all, since Derek had never mentioned that detail over the open radio channel. Vance's face didn't move, but something behind it did. Here is where the pressure starts climbing and does not come back down. Vance left the room and ordered a full search of everything Marcus was carrying, including the case sitting untouched in evidence storage. Maya, alone at her desk, quietly screenshotted the plate verification and copied the recorded call onto a private drive, sensing something was badly wrong. Within minutes, she noticed system logs deleting themselves in real time, piece by piece, in the unmistakable pattern of a supervisor moving carefully through a database, touching only what would matter later. She said nothing to anyone. She just kept copying, faster now, racing the deletions with her own trembling hands. Marcus's security escort reached the rendezvous point on schedule and found nothing. No vehicle. No signal. Colonel Renee Ashcroft, 47, commanding the security detail out of Fort Calloway, tried to trace the tracker embedded in the SUV and discovered it had been manually disabled from inside the patrol car that had pulled him over. Renee had run 3 combat tours and did not panic easily. She started making calls, and every one of them ended with the same 2 words, not found. Back at the station, Vance carried a pair of bolt cutters into the evidence room himself and told Derek to force the lock, waving off any concern about federal protocol as unnecessary caution. Derek pulled Marcus out of the interview room under the pretense of processing photographs, and when Marcus asked to make the phone call any detainee is entitled to, Derek refused, telling him that men who impersonate soldiers don't get to set conditions. When Marcus turned his head toward the sound coming from the evidence room, Derek accused him of resisting a lawful order, twisted his arm behind his back, and forced him down. This is the moment from the opening of this story. Watch it again, because now you know everything Marcus knew standing in it. He did not resist. He stated, without a trace of anger, that the hallway camera was almost certainly recording all of this. Derek glanced up, called over another officer, and had him block the lens with a stack of paperwork, ensuring whatever came next left no visual trace. Then he pressed Marcus down onto his knees, in the middle of the station floor, in full view of 6 officers and 2 administrative staff who happened to be walking through at exactly the wrong moment. Derek dropped his knee against Marcus's back, not hard enough to injure him, but exactly hard enough to humiliate him, to demonstrate for the room precisely where the power lived. He asked, grinning, whether an imaginary general could summon an army to come rescue him now. Marcus did not answer the taunt. He said only that Derek was mistaking his silence for weakness, and that the distinction would matter a great deal before this day was finished. Derek wasn't finished. He crouched down to Marcus's eye level, close enough that the room went even quieter, and asked if the general wanted to explain what a man like him was really doing with government plates and a locked case. Because in his experience, that combination usually meant something stolen, something sold, something a man like him had found a way to get his hands on that he had no business having. It was said loud enough for the whole room to hear, and it landed exactly the way it was meant to. Not as a question, but as a verdict delivered in front of an audience. Derek had built for himself out of 6 coworkers and 2 clerks who'd wandered over expecting entertainment. Marcus felt the weight of every eye in that room and did not lower his own. He held Derek's stare the way he'd once held the stare of an insurgent commander across a negotiating table in Kandahar, and something in that steadiness seemed to unsettle Derek more than any protest could have, because there was nothing in it for him to push against. Maya watched the entire scene from across the room, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone as she quietly turned on its recorder, capturing audio even with the camera blocked. Vance emerged from his office, looked at the man kneeling on his own station floor, and rather than intervening, ordered him moved to a holding cell to increase the pressure. Showing no concern at all for what half his department had just watched, in silence. Before he was pulled away, Marcus caught sight of Vance, approaching the case with the bolt cutters already raised, and he called out, once, that the case carried a security mechanism called a sentinel lock, and that tampering with it by anyone unauthorized would trigger an automatic emergency alert straight to military command. Vance laughed it off as a stall tactic. He believed, with the total confidence of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything, that nothing on the other end of that lock could reach him inside his own building. The moment the cutting blade touched the reinforced casing, a small red light on the handle of the case flared to life and stayed lit. That's the second frozen moment of this story. Hold it in your mind. The sound of the station, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the sudden dead quiet as that red light started blinking, and nobody in that room understanding yet what they had just done. For nearly a full minute, nobody moved. Vance stood there with the bolt cutters still in his hand, staring at the small pulsing light like a man trying to decide whether he'd imagined it. Derek's laughter had stopped entirely, replaced by the specific expression of a man doing rapid, panicked arithmetic. Even the printer in the corner seemed to have gone silent, though of course it hadn't. It only felt that way, the way a room feels when every ordinary sound is suddenly swallowed by one that isn't. Maya, watching from her desk, felt her pulse in her own throat. She would say later that the sound she remembered most from that entire day wasn't Derek's voice or Vance's orders. It was the quiet, mechanical click of that red light beginning its cycle, over and over, patient in a way that nothing else in that building had been. 41 minutes later, the ground outside began to shake. 8 armored vehicles rolled into the lot and sealed every exit. 38 soldiers stepped out in 2 lines, so tight they looked drawn with a ruler. At the front of the formation stood Colonel Renee Ashcroft, and beside her, a federal prosecutors named Diane Whitfield, who had been on the phone with a judge for the last 19 minutes, securing an emergency warrant the moment the sentinel alert reached Fort Calloway's command center. Every officer inside the Colton Ridge Police Department froze at once. Notice that word, froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The overhead lights buzzed the same way they had 5 minutes earlier. But the air in that room had changed completely. The particular silence of 40 people, simultaneously realizing they had bet everything on the wrong side of a story they didn't understand yet. Renee walked in first. She did not raise her voice. She asked calmly to see General Marcus Kane, and when Vance tried to claim there was no general in his custody, she held up a single printed sheet. His official Department of Defense service record, 4 stars stamped across the header, photograph unmistakable. That's the first layer of the reveal. A document, cold and undeniable, placed on the counter in front of a room that had spent the last hour deciding it didn't need to check. The second layer came 90 seconds later, when Diane Whitfield stepped past Vance without asking permission and read the federal warrant aloud, naming Marcus Kane by rank, naming the investigation into Callahan Armor Industries, naming the Colton Ridge Police Department as a location, now under a federal preservation order, for all evidence and recordings. A federal prosecutor, standing in the lobby, confirming everything Marcus had said from the very first minute. Nobody in that room could call it a misunderstanding anymore. Marcus was brought out of the holding cell. He did not run to Renee. He walked the same unhurried pace he'd carried through every minute of that day, and when he reached her, she came to full attention and saluted him before a single word passed between them. That's the frozen moment that ends this act. 38 soldiers standing at attention, a chief of police backing slowly toward his own office door, and Derek Holloway standing exactly where he'd been standing an hour earlier. Badge still pinned to his chest, understanding for the first time that the man he'd forced to his knees could have ended his career with a phone call at any point, and had chosen, instead, to simply ask him to make one. The investigation that followed moved fast, and it moved somewhere Colton Ridge never expected. Diane Whitfield's team traced the falsified certification numbers straight back to Callahan Armor Industries, whose engineers had quietly swapped the plating's core material for something 40% cheaper and routed the substitution through 3 shell suppliers to disguise it. Chief Russell Vance, it turned out, had spent 6 years as a paid security consultant for a subsidiary tied to Callahan Armor, and in exchange for a stream of payments routed through a private LLC in his wife's name, he'd spent months slowing down federal shipments and manufacturing exactly the kind of local incident that had unfolded that morning. The detour sign that had redirected Marcus off Highway 19 had not been an accident. It had been installed 11 hours in advance by a contractor with a Callahan Armor purchase order in his glove compartment. Vance had never expected the man carrying that case to be the general leading the entire investigation. He'd expected a courier, someone junior, someone replaceable, someone he assumed could be pressured without consequence. Derek had been chosen for that first stop specifically because Vance knew his history. 4 prior misconduct complaints, all quietly buried, all involving people. Derek had decided, on site, didn't have the standing to push back. What started as ordinary prejudice on an empty road had, without either of them realizing it, become the opening move in a $340 million cover-up. Preston Callahan, the company's CEO, called Vance's cell directly during the search, unaware the line was already seized and recording. Vance, understanding exactly what answering would mean, let it ring out. Diane Whitfield played Marcos a voicemail, recovered from that same line an hour earlier. Callahan's voice, flat and businesslike, demanding to know why the case hadn't been delivered yet, reminding Vance that the driver, as he called him, was not to leave that station under any circumstances. It was the first piece of evidence, placing the company's chief executive personally inside the conspiracy to intercept a federal investigation. Derek looked at Marcus, visibly shaken now, and asked what he intended to do to him. Marcus told him the decision had never been his to make. The law would decide. The same law Derek had spent the last hour bending around the assumption that his victim had no power to answer back. Vance vanished from his office not long after. Investigators found his access badge had opened the building's rear door 11 minutes before anyone noticed he was gone. The soldiers outside did not chase him with force. Renee held her formation and simply reported his position while federal agents moved in quietly. And Maya, still shaking, remembered an old maintenance passage connecting the station's basement to a municipal storage building 2 blocks over. Vance was found there 40 minutes later, trying to destroy a hard drive while frantically dialing a contact inside Callahan Armor, who never picked up. That drive held 11 years of buried misconduct complaints filed against Derek and 4 other officers, most of them altered, downgraded, or quietly pressured into withdrawal. The complainants had one thing in common. None of them had the money, the status, or the legal access to make the department answer for it. Marcus understood, reading through that stack in a federal conference room 2 days later, that he had not been the first person Derek Holloway forced to his knees. He was only the first one the system could no longer find a way to erase. Derek, sensing the walls closing in, tried offering information for leniency, admitting Vance had repeatedly ordered officers to pressure drivers passing through Colton Ridge, especially anyone connected to Callahan Armor's competitors or their whistleblowers. He kept repeating that he'd only been following orders. Marcus rejected that outright, in front of the same federal panel that would decide Derek's fate. Whitmore may have ordered the stop, Marcus said. But it was Derek who chose to mock a military ID, disable his own camera, and force a man who never once resisted him down onto the floor of a public building. Nobody ordered that particular cruelty. Derek supplied that part himself. Maya was made to confront her own share of it, too. She admitted, quietly, that she had stayed silent through 2 earlier incidents out of fear for her job. Marcus did not build her up into a flawless hero in that moment. He told her plainly that her earlier silence had likely helped a broken system keep functioning the way it always had, and that her decision to preserve the evidence today was the thing that finally stopped it. Something in that honesty landed harder than praise ever could have, and she handed investigators 4 months of private notes she'd been quietly keeping on her own, unprompted, unasked. Outside, the 38 soldiers held their formation under the station's parking lot lights, while news vans began arriving from 3 counties over, and Renee made certain none of it curdled into spectacle. When Marcus finally walked out into the evening air, every soldier present snapped to attention at once. He didn't ask them to salute him personally. He asked them to salute the only thing worth saluting that day. The idea that no one stands above the law and no one is diminished by the color of their skin while wearing it. Preston Callahan held a press conference 3 days later, flanked by 4 attorneys, insisting that Marcus had orchestrated the entire arrest as a personal vendetta against his company. He'd built Callahan Armor into a $2 billion name over 29 years, and he clearly believed that reputation alone could outlast a single soldier's testimony. He claimed the recovered samples had been tampered with. He claimed Vance had acted entirely alone. He suggested Marcus was exploiting public outrage to damage a company that had done nothing wrong. Reporters started asking, loudly, why a 4-star general had been transporting classified evidence alone in an unmarked vehicle in the first place. Questions Callahan's PR team practically fed them. Marcus refused to answer any of it with anger. He agreed to testify before a public hearing and made clear he wouldn't hide behind his rank while doing it. He explained the transport protocol in full, the reasoning behind the unmarked vehicle, the fact that his security detail had been deliberately separated from him by a fraudulent detour sign. Independent auditors confirmed every step of his route had followed standard federal procedure without a single deviation. Diane Whitfield released the location data, proving a contractor tied to Callahan Armor had installed that false sign hours before Marcus ever reached it. Maya submitted the recorded audio of Vance explicitly ordering that no one contact Fort Calloway throughout the entire encounter. Derek agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming under oath that Vance had taken direction from people connected to Callahan Armor for years. The decisive piece came from the Sentinel lock itself, which had recorded the exact timestamp, location, and electronic signature of the cutting tool used against it. That tool traced back to a private security firm, receiving direct funding from Callahan Armor, as part of a long-running arrangement with the Colton Ridge Police Department, combined with the voicemail proving Preston Callahan knew the case's exact contents before that information was ever made public. The evidence formed an unbroken chain, leading straight back to his office. He was arrested outside his own corporate headquarters on charges of obstructing a federal investigation, conspiracy, and contract fraud, and the footage of him being walked out in handcuffs, in the same tailored suit he'd worn to deny everything 3 days earlier, became the story's final and most public reversal. Even so, the story kept circling back to Derek, because the story was always really about him. At the formal hearing, the hallway footage played in full for the jury. There was no serious physical violence on the recording. Derek's own attorney leaned on that fact hard, repeating that Marcus hadn't sustained a single broken bone. Marcus answered him without raising his voice. Human dignity isn't only broken through fractures, he said. It's broken through the deliberate use of power to strip a man's worth away in front of a room full of people who could have said something and chose not to. He'd faced worse physical danger during 34 years of service, he told the jury. But being forced to kneel inside a building meant to represent justice had done something quieter and, in its own way, worse. Priya Chen testified too, on the second day of the hearing, her voice shaking through the first 2 questions before it steadied. She admitted, in front of the same department that still signed her paychecks, that she had watched Derek force a man to his knees and said absolutely nothing, because she was 26 years old, with a probationary contract and a brother's tuition bill, and she had told herself, in the moment, that silence was the same thing as safety. She looked at Marcus while she said it, not at the attorneys, not at the jury. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. Later, outside the courthouse, she found him by his car and said she was sorry, and he told her that an apology that costs you something, a job, a friendship, a comfortable silence, is the only kind that means anything, and hers had just cost her plenty in that room. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was closer to an acknowledgement that she had chosen, finally, to stop being one more person who looked away. Derek was convicted of abuse of authority, falsifying official records, and obstructing a federal investigation. Vance received a harsher sentence still, for conspiring to seize federal property, destroying evidence, and burying more than a decade of misconduct complaints filed against his own officers. Preston Callahan lost control of his company entirely. Every one of Callahan Armor's military contracts was suspended pending independent inspection of the entire product line. Maya went through a lengthy disciplinary review for her earlier silence. The board formally credited her for preserving the evidence that broke the case open, but she wasn't handed a promotion or paraded as a hero. She went through months of retraining instead, an outcome that felt honest rather than performative, the kind of accountability that arrives, slowly, in pieces, the way real accountability almost always does. Marcus turned down every offer of symbolic compensation the city tried to hand him afterward. He asked for one thing instead: that Colton Ridge release every buried misconduct complaint to the public and stand up a permanent, independent oversight board with real subpoena power. so that the next person pulled over on a quiet road wouldn't need 4 stars on their collar or 38 soldiers waiting outside to be treated like a human being. Here is the part nobody in the courtrooms saw, because it happened 3 weeks after the verdict, in a visiting room at a minimum security facility 80 miles outside Colton Ridge. Marcus had not been required to go. Nobody had asked him to. He drove himself, alone, the way he always had, and sat across a scratched metal table from Derek Holloway, who had lost 11 pounds and something behind his eyes that Marcus almost didn't recognize as regret because he'd never once seen it on that face before. Derek asked him, quietly now, whether things would have gone differently if he'd simply recognized the rank the moment he saw it. Marcus told him. The question itself proved he still hadn't understood the real problem. A person should never need a general's rank or a billionaire's fortune or any title at all to be treated with basic decency. Derek sat with that for a long time, long enough that the guard by the door shifted his weight twice. Then, for the first time since the morning this all began, Derek said it plainly, without a lawyer's careful phrasing softening the edges. He'd looked at a black man in a plain jacket on an empty road and decided, before a single word was spoken, exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. He said he'd carry that for the rest of his life, whether anyone forgave him for it or not. Marcus didn't offer him forgiveness that day. He didn't owe him that, and he didn't pretend to. He simply nodded once, stood, and told him that recognizing it, finally, honestly, without an excuse trailing behind it, was the only thing that could ever come next. And it was still worth doing, even 11 pounds and 1 felony conviction too late. 6 months after the verdict, Marcus returned to the exact room where he had once been forced to his knees. The Colton Ridge Police Department had been rebuilt from the inside out by then. Body cameras could no longer be manually disabled, while an officer remained on active duty. Every stop involving a federal vehicle now required verification from 2 separate command levels before an officer could act. Every misconduct complaint was routed automatically to the new independent review board, the one Marcus had asked for, instead of a check. New officers now spent an entire day of their training, walking through the events of that single afternoon in exact, uncomfortable detail, studying precisely how fast an assumption can spiral into an abuse of power when nobody in the room is willing to slow down and ask one simple question. The city council, which had spent years to acknowledge a pattern in its own department, voted unanimously to fund that oversight board permanently, not as a gesture to quiet public anger, but as something built to outlast the anger entirely. Marcus came back for the public announcement of those reforms. The room where he'd once knelt on the tile had been converted into a transparency archive, a public space where anyone could track the status of any complaint ever filed against the department in real time, on a screen mounted where the old evidence counter used to stand. Maya still worked at the station, in a reduced role, while her formal review wrapped up, and she thanked him, quietly, for never once trying to minimize her share of what had happened. He told her that meaningful change only ever mattered when people were willing to look honestly at both what they had done and what they had failed to do. Maya's own review had ended 2 weeks earlier. She'd been cleared to return to full duty with a formal commendation attached to her file, a single line that read, in the flat language of bureaucratic paper, for preservation of critical evidence under conditions of significant personal risk. She kept the printed copy folded in her wallet, not because she needed reminding of what she'd done, but because she needed reminding, on the slow ordinary days when nothing dramatic was happening, that doing the right thing rarely looks like a movie. It looks like something falls at your desk with your hands shaking, hoping nobody notices before you're finished. Outside, Renee Ashcroft stood with a small handful of soldiers, and this time there were no vehicles forming a perimeter, no tents formation, no press cameras, crowding the entrance to catch a spectacle. Marcus looked down at the exact spot on the floor where he'd once been forced to kneel. He felt no particular triumph knowing Derek had lost his badge, or that Vance now sat behind bars, or that Callahan's name had been quietly stripped off the front of a building in 3 different states. The real victory, he understood standing there, was that the next person to walk through that door would never need 4 stars on their collar, or 38 soldiers waiting outside just to be treated fairly. Before he left, he reached into his left breast pocket and closed his hand around the same scratched brass coin his father had pressed into his palm 39 years earlier. He didn't hold it up. He didn't explain it to anyone standing nearby. He just felt the worn edge of it against his palm one more time, the way he had on that back road and in the interview room and on his knees on that very floor. And he understood, finally, exactly what his father had meant all those years ago. Wear the uniform. Don't ever let it wear you. He turned it over once in his fingers and slid it back into his pocket, and he offered a brief statement to the small crowd gathered outside. That day, he said, they believed forcing a man to his knees could make him smaller. But power was never proven by making another person bow. It was proven by protecting the dignity of someone who couldn't call in 38 soldiers to save themselves. Outside in the courtyard, Renee offered him a formal salute, and he returned it before climbing into the same unmarked sport utility vehicle that had once convinced Derek Holloway he had to be some kind of imposter. The vehicle pulled away from Colton Ridge in the kind of quiet, unhurried silence that only comes after something true has finally been settled. Behind it, a newly mounted sign outside the station caught the last light of the afternoon, carrying a message meant to outlast every headline this case had ever generated. No one stands above the law, and no one falls beneath basic human dignity. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, maybe even yourself in one of the rooms where nobody said anything, hit like so, it reaches the person who needs to hear it tonight. Share it with someone who's ever been made to feel small in a room full of people who could have spoken up and didn't. And leave a comment. Have you ever been in that room? And which person were you? I read every single one.